Hey guys, welcome back to Science. So today we are going to start by reading in our hardcover books on page 38, so go ahead and grab that. Before we begin, I'm going to go over our vocabulary for this lesson. So our first vocabulary word is need. And a need is an object or condition required for survival. For instance, something that humans need, and most living things, need food, water, and shelter. Those are three basic needs that we have as living things. If we don't have those things, we're not going to be able to thrive in our environment. The second vocabulary word we have is resource. And a resource is a supply of something useful for survival. So for instance, if you were stranded on a deserted island, a natural resource that you might find is something like a coconut tree or a mango tree, or a freshwater spring, a supply of fresh water, because you're surrounded by the salt water that you can't drink. So if you have fresh water that you can drink, that's a great resource that's going to keep you alive, hopefully long enough for you to get rescued. All right, so we're starting on page 38 at System of Life. It says a need is something an organism requires for survival, like we were talking about the food, water, those resources, those needs. And a resource is a supply of something an organism can use for its survival. The living and non-living things that surround an organism provide the resources it needs. The living and non-living things in an organism's surroundings function as part of a single system. In order for an organism to survive, it must be part of a system. For example, a pine must be able to sink its roots into the soil. It must withstand the temperature and moisture changes around it. The pine tree must also withstand being used as a resource for animals like birds and squirrels. These interactions demonstrate that a pine is part of a system. So when it says birds and squirrels, what do birds and squirrels have to do with pine trees? Well, they have to have homes too, right? They have to have shelter, and so they are going to use the tree for shelter. So birds might make a hole in the pine tree, and it has to withstand these things. So it is part of the birds and the squirrel system because it is providing shelter for them. An organism will not always benefit from interacting with the organisms in its surroundings. Sometimes an interaction with another organism will neither help nor hurt it, and other times the interaction will result in the organism's death. So when I hear that, the first thing that comes to my mind is the mistletoe that is in trees outside. It kind of looks like these little green branches that are coming out of a big circle in the tree. And that's killing the tree, right? So that's called a parasite, and it is using the tree as a shelter, and it is killing the tree as it is kind of sucking the life out of it. All right, so that's what I think of when it says it will result in the organism's death. So eventually that tree's going to die if it has that mistletoe in it. All right, let's look at those zebra pictures. Our caption says, zebras interact with other organisms such as grass, cattle, egrets, and lions. These interactions can be beneficial or good, neutral, so it doesn't have any effect, or harmful for the zebra. Zebras eat grass, so they benefit from the interaction with the grass. All right, let's look at that next caption. It says zebra and cattle egrets do not eat each other or compete for the same resources. So these interactions are neutral for the zebras. So those egrets are what's sitting on top of that zebra, that bird there. So it doesn't really bother the zebra. It's just kind of sitting there, and they're around them. So it doesn't bother the zebra, it doesn't do it any harm. Let's look at that lion picture. It says lions eat zebras, so this interaction is deadly for some zebras, but also helps to control the overall zebra population. So the lions make sure that the zebras don't overpopulate, so they don't take up all the food sources and that they don't grow too big in number. All right, so they're not competing with the same food sources, but they are taking up the same space. All right, let's look at that quick fact. It says coral reefs provide resources such as shelter, food, and nutrients that hundreds of organisms need to survive. Very interesting. Coral's very helpful. Flip the page there. Competition and symbiosis. Two or more organisms are in competition when their relationships involve struggling for the same resource. Okay, so we talked about how the egrets and the zebras aren't in competition for food. They eat different things, so they're neutral. But now we have animals that are in competition for the same food or the same resource. Because populations are groups of organisms of the same species, the members of a population will have the same needs and resources as each other. The members of the populations help each other get the resources they need. The members of other populations compete for the same resources. So it's saying zebras will help other zebras graze and get the land that they want for that grass, but they're also going to be competing with the other types of animals that also eat that grass. Okay, so they're in competition with each other with other species of animals that also eat the same things that they do. Okay, let's move to honeybees. Honeybees cooperate to meet their needs. Resources are shared between all the bees in a hive or the nest. To the snakes. Like most snakes, emerald tree boas compete with other emerald tree boas from the moment they hatch. So those animals, the snakes, are always in competition with each other. So it's unlike the zebras, where the zebras help each other. The snakes are always at each other's throats fighting for those resources that they have in the wild. Mother grizzly bears help their cub find and eat food, but adult grizzlies compete with each other for food. So, depending on how old the grizzly bears are, it depends on whether or not they're going to be fighting for resources or helping each other. So when they're babies, the mom is going to help find them food, but when they grow older, maybe not so much. Okay, let's move on. A community contains many different species. Sometimes these species have the same needs and resources. Other times they have different needs and resources. Symbiosis is a close relationship in which two or more organisms from different species live together and depend on each other for food and help, for health and survival. So, symbiosis is kind of an interesting topic. So it says, it's a close relationship in which two or more organisms from different species live together and depend on each other for help. So if you have seen pictures of sharks or you've been to an aquarium, you might have seen these little fish that go along with the sharks. They kind of look like they're sucking on the sharks a little bit, and those animals benefit from living with the sharks because they eat little things off of the sharks, and the sharks no longer have those little things on them, so they both benefit from that relationship. Some organisms in a community meet their needs by living in or on other kinds of organisms, like we talked about. A host is an organism with a parasite living in or on it. Parasites meet the needs from their host, causing harm to it. So we talked about the mistletoe on the trees that's constricting it and getting into its supply of resources that it has in its trunk. So it's eventually going to kill it. So that would be a parasite. Other organisms meet the need for food by eating members of other species in the community. These interactions help one organism while hurting another. So let's look down at that Joshua tree picture. It says the Joshua tree is pollinated by the yucca moth. The yucca moth lays its eggs in the Joshua tree. So the Joshua tree is pollinated, meaning it was able to grow because of the moth, and then the moth laid its eggs in the tree. So it is a symbiotic relationship. Each of them is not being hurt by the other one, they are helping each other. So it's a symbiotic relationship with those two. Let's look at the humpback whale. It says the humpback whale is often covered with crustaceans called barnacles. The barnacles filter food out of the water as the whale swims. They do so without hurting the whale. So they're not in competition with the whale because the whale's not trying to eat those things. It is simply just helping the barnacles by being on top of the whale. All right, so those are our pages for today. See you later.